to the How Could You podcast. I'm Lauren Tocci.
I'm Ryan Tocci, and we are the people.
You know, of all of Travis Bickle's diatribes, I was very worried where your opening quote could go, and I'm really glad you went with that.
That's understandable, because, folks, buckle in, because we have a lot to cover about today's movie. This was once inspired by an assassination attempt, and then later inspired an assassination attempt. So it's going to get a little heavy in here.
No, I just think this is a really great follow-up to Hocus Pocus.
It seems like the obvious transition.
They exist in the same universe, is what you're telling me. Well, welcome to our podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, we are two people who fell in love at a movie theater and never quite left. This project started as two people who are movie obsessed wanting to fill gaps in their film knowledge, but, has evolved over time, and we answer different how could you questions about movies. Although today we're taking it back to its core, with this being a very big how could you for one of us. But before we get there, do you have any Tossi's takes this week?
I do, and I know we have a lot to cover today, so I'll be quick. I highly recommend American Crime Story Impeachment on FXX right now, the series. It's about the Clinton scandal in the 90s, which is what we should always continue to call it. It's a really interesting, view of what went on then. It kind of takes out the politics and the punchlines and allows you to see the human aspects of what was happening. Really good, and Beanie Feldstein is amazing as Monica Lewinsky. The whole cast is really good, but she is just absolutely just phenomenal. Great actress. Show's really good. Highly recommend it.
No, can't agree more. It's wonderfully done, and it's a really good media gut check, I think, for any era, because, we want to think we're far removed from where we would completely tear down a person's life for our own enjoyment, but we're not.
Yeah, episode 6 makes you go, we as a society failed.
Oh, completely. Yeah. Mine is going to be a film that just came out this past week. So we are big fans of Edgar Wright. We just saw Last Night in Soho, and it was incredible. It was everything that I hoped it to be, and a lot more, because we had seen a more recent trailer and we were worried that a lot of it had gotten spoiled. It had not. The acting in it is so impeccable. The cinematography is so incredibly absorbing and I would say hypnotic. It makes you simultaneously want to be in Soho in the 60s and not all at the same time. It is a really great film. I highly recommend checking out. It's visually interesting and stunning and does some really cool stuff. There's some really interesting conversations in the film, and I cannot applaud the movie enough.
Totally agree. Perfectly cast. One of the most perfectly cast films I've seen in a long time. Beautiful color palette. Just really phenomenal soundtrack. Terrific.
And, it's kind of apropos that we should have seen this film last week. So, this, there's a lot of noir vibes in Last Night in Soho. And the film we're talking about today is actually a neo-noir. We are here today to talk about Martin Scorsese's 1976 Taxi Driver.
You would say Taxi Driver. The AFI ranked it in the top 50, 100 films of all time. Martin Scorsese, one of the greatest directors of all time. Movie that gets 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, 93% audience score. Just a movie that all film lovers had to have seen and experienced, right? So it begs the question, Lauren Tocci, how could you not have seen Taxi Driver?
I have no excuses. So it's really, okay, I am a sucker for movies about New York. I am a sucker for Martin Scorsese. I have no defense for why I didn't see this. I think now, having seen it, I could defend more why I hadn't seen it, but I knew minimal about this film. I knew the "you talking to me" line and that Jodie Foster plays a prostitute. I knew nothing else going into this film. I don't know how I've kept my understanding of it so completely knowledgeless. That's not even a word, but it is now. I don't know. I have nothing for you as to why. And I wish I did. I wish I could say oh, it didn't appeal. I can't even say that. I love young DeNiro. I don't know why I haven't seen this film.
It's a movie that surprised, like, even up until, so this
It
is probably
should.
this is literally our most how could you moment, because most of the episodes we have done in how could you, we had previously seen, but just much later in life or in the last year or so, like this. This is one that you literally just seen in the last week.
Yes.
Like, that's, you finally sat down and you watched it. So it's as fresh a how could you as we've had on this show. And it's a movie that, quite frankly, I, as your husband, am still shocked that you didn't see.
You should be. And because, I mean, we talk about film all the time and how it hasn't come up, like, or how I haven't sat down to watch it is kind of insane.
And it's not a, how could you not have seen this, as in you need to like this or dislike it. I'm not even going to get to that. I know you're going to, have lots of opinions and talk about it a lot today. It's just one of those movies that just is so iconic from a pop culture standpoint, from a film standpoint. It's got these lines that everybody knows, this character that's just completely, that's why I think it's just so surprising.
Well, and I'll be honest, like, even as we're going to discuss this today, it's so fresh in my mind that I know my analysis is going to be pretty raw and unformed, which is not normally how we do things. Like, normally, like, I've had a lot of time to mull things over. I've been mulling this movie over in my mind. We were, like, at a gathering, and, like, things were, like, popping in my head, like, little, like, pop-up video bubbles, and I'm like... Because this movie it's in my head, and I'm thinking a lot about it.
I can see you itching a lot since we watched to talk to me about it.
Oh gosh, 100%. So if you are listening for the first time, or maybe you haven't remembered this from a previous episode, we legitimately will watch a movie and we do not talk about it until we go to sit down and record, because we want the conversation to be, hopefully, come across as fresh as possible. This is one I've been trying to get you to, like, break and talk to me about it, and you absolutely have refused.
That's true.
I've been, like, poking at you about
it.
So you had seen this previously.
I have,
when did you see it?
So I saw it at probably, the demographic that this movie was probably made most for.
You're not an incel?
Well, all right, fair. But 20-year-old male. Early 20s, mid-20s male. I saw this. I can't remember the specific, this was probably in a dorm room or at home, but it was definitely... Of
course it was in a dorm room.
Yeah, it was right after, after high school, first or second year in college, finally sat down and watched it. I haven't seen it a lot. It's something that I actually thought about a lot when watching it, because I don't think I've seen this movie in over 20-some years.
So you've not revisited it?
I haven't. No, I remember really liking it at the time. I thought I remembered it very, a lot. But then we watched it, and it's so much. It's kind of almost feels a weird how could you, because I'm now viewing it obviously as a 42-year-old as compared to early 20s. So you're looking at it through a very different lens, especially in 2021. But what was interesting was I didn't remember the epilogue at all. If you had asked me before this movie, I would have told you and remembered that Travis dies at the end.
Okay, so here's the thing. I did no research for this movie. The only thing I saw coming up when I had typed in a few things, because I was just curious, like, lingering questions I had about the film, was so many people having that same experience as you. And I thought, this is absurd.
It made me feel a lot better. I'm not going to lie to you. I came across that in my research as well, and I'm like, I don't know.
Why do you think that is?
I think Mandela effect a little bit,
You
right?
Bernstein Bared him.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I don't know. And it's interesting because we're going to have to talk about that ending. And there's a lot to unpack with that ending. I don't know if that plays into it. I don't know if, when you see these AFI does, these film clips and montages and things like that. You always get the, are you looking at me? Are you talking to me? Or the shot of Travis laying on the ground, bloody, with his finger to his, temple. You'll see that come a lot. I don't know if that's it. I don't know if it's because this character, feels like it should go out in a blaze of glory, whether positively or negatively. I don't know what it is. But honestly, that movie, it's pulling back at the end, and I'm going, oh, yeah. Very cool, thinking about, And then it just kept going. I'm like, what is this? For a second, I thought we were watching a director's cut. So it's an interesting thing. But, I don't know what that all means exactly. I don't think it takes away my feelings on the film when I first saw it or how I feel about it today. But just an interesting little aspect. And again, really happy to know I am not the only one.
No, it was interesting reading this because, I was just trying to, kind of brush up and remind myself of, what period, because, New York, obviously history, it has, so many, any place. It's got so many, movements and time periods. This is, pre-Mayor Koch Manhattan, post-Stonewall, post-Vietnam, pre-AIDS, pre-Mayor Koch, so gentrification, and obviously Mayor Koch, a really complicated figure, like a lot of mayors in New York City's history.
What are you talking about?
Yeah. No, they're all great. But you have obviously what comes next, but this is a really interesting starting point to see you see all of the racial tensions, the tension of neighborhoods, you see, obviously the intense prejudices of the city, kind of coming to light. So it's interesting where this is situated at such kind of what seems almost like a spark could light anything right now, right? And I feel like that tension's in the film, but it's interesting historically. Scorsese was really capturing something.
I find everything that you're saying, I completely agree with you. Totally see exactly what you're saying. And it's really interesting because, so Paul Schrader wrote this script, and, we're going to have to talk about him quite a bit, obviously, because his, DNA is all over this film as much as Martin Scorsese. And what's interesting is the Travis character was originally written as a white supremacist.
Hashtag not shocked.
Yeah. So Sport was written as an African American. Travis was written as a white supremacist. And Scorsese actually is the one that ends up pulling back on that. And he didn't want the movie to be racist. That was his fear. So that's why he ends up deciding to. Now, some of it was, when we get into talking about the cast a little bit, was the choice of Harvey Keitel to actually play the character of Sport. So some of that's there. And then obviously they pulled a lot further back on.
You mean Harvey Keitel chose to be the pimp to a child prostitute?
He did.
Okay. We'll get there.
Yeah, so Scorsese had worked with Harvey Keitel on Mean Streets prior to this, and I don't remember which character, I apologize. He had the choice, they tried to bring him in for another character, and yeah, he actually chose. That character was only supposed to have 2-3 lines. So Harvey Keitel ends up asking to take the role, and the role expands a little bit, further. Scorsese obviously then doesn't want to make the Travis character so, obviously white supremacist and racist.
Funny, it still comes through.
It does. I don't think there's any way viewing it's not, because, anytime we're getting a point of view shot of Travis, there's a leering, there is an uncomfortableness, and the camera is choosing to see it through the lens of Travis. So you can't really argue, anything other than that's what Travis is supposed to be seeing and how he's supposed to be feeling.
Well, and I think, so much is talked about, with film, obviously, and, classic film theory, talking about, the male gaze in film. And I think that this adds a different layer of almost, it's the racist male gaze. Because everything that Travis is doing, we understand without him verbalizing is so coded. He makes some grand proclamation earlier in the movie of, he'll pick up anyone, doesn't matter to him. And, and I found this character, I wrote a lot of notes about this as we were watching it this first time of, I'm having a hard time pinning down this guy's morals. Because, again, I knew so little going into it. I didn't know Travis was going to become a villain until I hit a certain point in the film and I went, oh, okay, I think I see where this is going. But, I think that, the thing that Scorsese does, at least from a camera's point of view, and I can't speak to, Paul Schrader's, screenwriting with this, but from Scorsese's point of view, I understand immediately that Travis's gaze leers at persons of color.
He does, yes.
You see it with the other cab driver, with the two men who are in the diner, and how they're situated, at an angle, and you can just almost feel, Travis's eyes, going towards them. And the sense that Travis, even in the space where he's obviously trying to, and I hate to say it this way, quote unquote, macho himself up, he feels threatened immediately by anyone who's non-white. And you see it too when he fetishizes the woman who is at the porno theater and almost like disgusted that she spurns his advances. Like, dude, you're a guy going into a porno theater. Can you not understand why she's going to think you're immediate creepazoid? Like, and I'm sorry, no judgments to people's activities, but like at the same time, like he doesn't understand like where she would feel vulnerable. Like, you are a white male coming into a porno theater. She's a person of color. Like, there's such this immediate like disregard that I think Travis has of like what he's doing and how he's showing us the city. And I think that's, important and purposeful by Scorsese of like understanding like the baked in racial tensions in this city.
You talked about, the macho-ness of it, and Scorsese actually tried to spin this at one time with an interview with Roger Ebert by calling it his feminist film. Right? He says, because it takes macho to its logical conclusion. The better man is the man who can kill you. This movie shows that kind of thinking shows the kinds of problems some men have bouncing back and forth between their perception of women as goddesses and whores. So yeah,
are you just trying to anger me at this point? Like, what am I to do? So here is, and I know we'll get into obviously talking about the characters of Iris and Betsy a little bit more, but like, oh gosh, if I have to justify in this twisted way of like, no, it's not a feminist film, but I think it does approach the notion of toxic masculinity. Like, Travis is someone that like, baked into part of his morals is his ownership of women. They need to be saved or they need to be stopped. Like, he obviously has a sense of morality about how women are to behave in society and quote unquote how they're supposed to be treated in society. And it's not feminist, but what it does show is the problematic nature of essentially Travis's feeling towards women and like how he's been reinforced by society that it should feel complete ownership over the situation.
So let's pull the onion back a little bit, right? Like, let's talk about Travis and how we travel with him. Because what is, some things we want to say positive about the film right off the bat is this is it feels like an independent Scorsese film. You feel like you're almost documentary style following yes. Travis. Like, and that is both as a positive and a negative.
It's so unsettling.
This movie, you feel... I understand that there are themes that unfortunately that we are still feeling today, and that's what resonates with this movie. But it also feels like a movie of its time. It feels every bit its age, in my opinion. But Travis is an interesting character because we're really following him throughout, right? Like, and how do we get there? How do we get to the end result of Travis? Like, we're picking up on a character who is supposedly a Vietnam vet, an ex-military. I've heard a couple of theories that he is not for different reasons.
Explain some of his awkwardness.
Some of his awkwardness, some of kind of things that he does throughout that doesn't really jive with, being ex-military. He seems really uneasy at first with guns.
But that could be a manifestation of his PTSD.
Yes, and so let's just take it at face value that he is. So you have, we talk about the 70s. I mean, you can't get away from Vietnam era films and how much it really built its characters. And
well, yeah, entirely. Like, you look at like Travis Bickle, like what is he but not like the complete fear of like what are soldiers coming back as? Yeah. Like he's so traumatized clearly by the Vietnam War, and I think he's meant to be representational of like we sent our men off to fight in a war and then completely ignored their existence when they came home and denied that they were going to have like deep effects from the things that they saw. And then what did that breed? And what did that, again, I hate to use this term, but what did that bake into notions of masculinity that we see Travis, going through? Like, what do we see with notions of extremism as being representational of masculinity that come from an era in which We asked you to go fight in a war. You came back. We had nothing for you. And you felt abandoned. And what does that go into? But like, kind of the affluent end of the 70s and then the 80s with like, all of that decadence. Like, but what did we do to heal that? And the thing is what makes that really hard is because if we take that to the character of Travis Bickle, like where he ends up is like, is he a product of his own demented morality? Is this someone who is always, unfortunately, naturally marching towards this kind of extremist conclusion? Or is this someone made by trauma? And the hard thing to deal with is when we have to look at it as, did the violence beget his kind of violent ways of looking at society? Well, isn't that the fault of the people who sent him over? But then he comes back with such this twisted sense of like heightened justice and heightened self-importance. You can tell by his journal entries.
Well, and there's some things that we need to address. One, it's never actually specifically said that he was in Vietnam. We do make leaps on that.
That's fair. Because
so
he said he was a Marine, right? Like, doesn't he say that?
He does say he's ex-military and he was honorably discharged. So now you talked about the journaling, and I want to get back to, Travis and everything he's going through because we need to talk about the insomnia and the place that he is in his life. But you're talking about the journaling, and I think this is something that's very important to know about the Travis character and what Schrader based this character off of. So Travis Bickle is based off of two things. One, Schrader himself and what he was going through at the time.
Oh, God.
And a man by the name of Arthur Bremer, who I'll get to Bremer in a second. But so Schrader at this point, he writes this when he was essentially suffering a nervous breakdown in LA. Like, he was fired from AFI.
Wow.
He was friendless, he said at the time. He was in the midst of a divorce. He had a girlfriend who had just rejected him. He was squatting at the ex-girlfriend's apartment while she was away for months. He didn't talk to anybody. He said he went to porno theaters. He developed an obsession with guns. He was working as a delivery man for a chicken restaurant. So he said he felt the same isolation of Bickle. And he essentially writes this in like a week. So he's going through the mind of what Travis is. And I'm not saying I'm putting all these other themes that we're putting on, but at least that isolation portion.
Well, because there's that really like tragic line where he says he's like, I'm just another one of God's lonely people. Like, because I do think that is what makes Travis at first sympathetic, is the fact that you're like this loneliness, this isolation, this fatigue.
Because we can't escape the fact that loneliness is an illness. It can just sink into you and drive people without the right outlets and
support systems.
Exactly. And it's not to say every person that's lonely is going to turn it into a Travis Bickle, but when you couple it with all of these other things that we're talking about with Travis, again, the insomnia, the post-war, this, in living in a city that he hates, he is driving in the midnight hours overnight, where you are seeing a different version of the city. This movie takes place during the trash strike. The city that you're seeing, that's not there. That trash and everything is real at the time. So all of that is gonna build up into this, again, that what we're talking about, this loneliness that's an illness that drives Travis to start, going one way or the other.
And the thing is to understand is that, in the late 70s in New York, there is this like incredible financial prosperity that happens. And I am not saying that is evenly distributed, but this is 100% set during that time. Like you're talking about the sanitation strike of, it is true, haves and haves nots in Manhattan, especially in Manhattan. Like you were talking like the wealthiest of the wealthy and then the not.
The other thing that this movie's inspired by is Arthur Bremer, who I was talking about. Arthur Bremer actually was the gentleman who had an assassination attempt on George Wallace when George Wallace was running for president. So Bremer had wanted to actually it was not political. He just wanted to make a mark. He was a lonely, jilted guy and wanted to just make a mark in the world, wanted the assassination attempt was meant to be for Nixon, but realized he couldn't get through the security, so then chose to, unfortunately, shoot George Wallace, who ends up being paralyzed by that attempt. And then the real aspect of the Arthur Bremer part is the journals. So he had wrote these journals upon journals of everything, and I believe had been turned into a book at some point. I could be slightly mistaken.
Who wants to read that?
Right. So it's kind of this legacy that he ends up leaving, I think that's all of these things that, Travis is genuinely taken from real life people and events, and I think that's why he feels so real, and then also gives you this very strange, how you're supposed to feel about it.
Well, and I think that's what makes it so disturbing. And listen, I gotta give you credit, because I didn't know where that story was going. I remember the assassination attempt on George Wallace. I did not remember the name of the person who did it. So I really appreciate that you completely flipped the script by being oh, this gentleman, and then being oh yeah, by the way, it's the guy who tried to kill George Wallace. Because I think the thing is that there's no way of denying, Travis Bickle's a psychopath. There's no way of denying it. I don't say that to just, dismiss all of the, I think, really interesting arguments that are happening here of, how that happens. But it's disturbing to watch the birth of a psychopath. When villains pop on the scene and you know them innately as villainous, it's much more comfortable. We like situating things. This is good. This is bad. It's comfortable way of telling storytelling, and it's what we're so engineered to expect. So when you're watching a movie and you're seeing the descent, and it's not like villainy, it's not like a cool origin story for a villain in a superhero movie. No, this is a guy who is your everyday run-of-the-mill homicidal maniac that you're terrified of, and this is how he becomes that. And it starts because I was taking a lot of notes about the journal entries, and I was one of the really interesting things I thought is how Scorsese has the narration slow down. So it goes from the speed at which the thoughts are happening to the speed at which he's writing it. And I think that this film does so much with the notion of disruption. It is disruption of your visual, your imagery. You'll have kind of the opening. You've got that Bernard Herrmann score that just sounds like this kind of smooth, jazz. It's vibey, it's 70s. But then these shots of Travis kind of bathed in the red stoplights of the cabs that are in front of him, or even how the taxi moves through the city. It's boxy, you get it close up, it feels like a character all to itself, but then you get these close shots of Travis. You have this weird melding of man, machine, grimy city, but bright lights. This is such a story of disruption, and I think it's so important what you're pointing out, and I'm honestly learning this for the first time, of the fact that this is so based on real people, I think is why you can have all those disruptions, because when something like this happens, it feels like a disruption to the normal order of things. People aren't supposed to make assassination attempts on guys running for political office. It's not supposed to happen. So when it happens, it feels like a disruption in the natural order of things. So in this way, doesn't this whole film just feel like a repeat of those disruptions?
Absolutely. So we're talking a lot about the narration / journaling. Kind of looking at this movie as as the film end of it. What's your feeling on that? Because I know narration gets such a, polarizing type feeling from different people, where some feel it's lazy. I don't believe you're one of those individuals.
Here's the thing. I think narration, when done well, can be a really great device, because I do think there are sometimes just things that you don't want to leave open to interpretation. And this character is crafted in a way to be kind of that, I think, not a completely slow descent. We get there, pretty quickly in the movie, but there is kind of this sympathetic thing. I mean, honestly, up until he takes Sybil Shepherd to a porno theater, I was like, maybe he's okay. But then you go back and you analyze and you're like, oh no, all the bad stuff was there the whole entire time, right from the beginning of the movie. But I think the narration here, where I think it serves, is because I think the disturbing nature of being inside the psychopath's mind is really helpful, because he writes it like he's normal. These are just, these are my musings. There's nothing wrong. There's this one earlier on, it's about Betsy, who's played by Sybil Shepherd. And he says, like, she's an angel out of this filthy mess. They cannot touch her. And I was like, oh, dude, that's so eerie that you wrote that. But it's the fact that, like, because you have to get the sense, because okay, so I think young De Niro is very charming.
Yeah.
And easy on the eyes, let's be honest. But, like, I think if you were just watching young De Niro watching Sybil Shepherd, there'd almost be this sense of, like, oh, he's lonely and he's falling in love, guys. But the narration helps to reinforce, no, this is unhealthy. This is an obsession that is, it's predatory, it's possessive. And I think that's the thing is like the narration helps to remind us of what's going on underneath. Like, because I think that's one of the better things about De Niro being in this part is the fact that he's charming. I almost get how people could watch this movie, be fooled, and be like, he's an anti-hero. Like, I almost could because he is so intriguing. There's something so captivating about the De Niro stare that, like, I could see how almost you get tricked by it. All right, no, I actually can't see how you get tricked by it. He's a horrible human being in the movie. Well, he's enigmatic in a way in which I think you can... It makes it easier to get there with some of the sympathy at the beginning of the film because it's De Niro.
I think that's important. The stuff with Betsy is really interesting because you're right. There's an entitlement that he has with essentially the two women characters that he ends up, speaking with and dealing with. And Betsy, I mean, he puts her up, he knows nothing about her. Yeah. Literally nothing. And as you're talking about, he's made her an angel. And then Scorsese puts her in all white. So there's, but we're seeing, again, looking at Travis, and I think this might be really the first moment that we pull away from Travis's point of view, right? Travis is looking at her through glass. Yes. His own taxi, then through the glass of the campaign headquarters. And then we finally pull out from him and we get Betsy and Albert Brooks in his great role in this, small role, but he's a lot of fun in it. Good character. And we're seeing Betsy, and he comes in with a confidence, right? And I think Betsy is supposed to be a really strong individual. And I think that's why she's willing to give Travis a chance at first, right? Travis comes in, he's interesting, he's confident, he's much different than Albert Brooks.
Yeah.
So I think she's willing to take a chance. But the problem is Travis immediately, which she doesn't see, which she doesn't understand, but we as the audience do, is he's taken ownership immediately with her.
Yeah, and there's a way in which, again, you bring it back to this leering thing. Like, he glares, we see how he glares at others with judgment, and he glares at her of, like, you're mine, it's possessive, and you have to function in this way. He feels like he has very strict rules. You're an angel, you're untouchable, you're this prize. But what do you mean you're so insulted I took you to a porno theater? Like... He wants to have her both ways and is disgusted when she can't be both. And then supplants and says, essentially, like, Travis feels like his kind of sexuality and his perspective on attraction is the only that matters. And then, like, because he has that horrifying line about, like, she's just like the others. Like, so he essentially...
Yes, but you're talking about later on when he comes back to the campaign headquarters. Agree completely. That's a huge line of, when he starts saying that to her. Like, he just... You understand how he views all women in that very specific
because he wants her... Because there's almost something with them of how this is played. It feels sweet. It does feel at point like you could almost... Again, it's this disruption of you could almost think they're two people falling in love until you remember what Travis actually is.
Well, let's talk then about the diner scene.
Yes.
Because I think that is even more pivotal than the porno theater when they go in there. Because I think that's kind of the break-in moment for her to realize all the quote-unquote red flags of going, no, this isn't just an interest in person. This is just not a person. That's for me, and he is much different than what I had hoped. Yeah. Right? So that's her breaking point, and Travis just doesn't understand that. He can only bring her into the world that he knows, and he's so... isolated, that he doesn't know any, and he talks about that, right? But what problem is then from there, he spirals. He's never able to get any control to himself to try to handle the situation or just control his own, again, entitlement. But the diner, I think, is much more interesting from us as the audience because we're hearing these red flags right from the beginning. Like, when they're in there, right off the bat, Travis is talking about, and again, I apologize, I don't remember Albert Brooks' character's name.
Tom,
thank you. Of course it's Tom.
Of course it's Tom.
He already is saying he doesn't like Tom, right? Yep. And he's essentially telling her to stay away from her.
What is it? He's got energy that's going in the wrong places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really, it's
odd.
It's odd. And, and I think she's just trying to feel it out. Like, is this guy for real? Is he, what type of person is he, And, he writes in the journal at that point where he's trying to impress, and he's just like, she could get anything. She chose to get the fruit bowl, but she could get anything she wanted. Right?
Oh, it's so disgusting.
And he thinks that he keeps talking about money, and I can just do this, and all these weird, just, again,
It's these weird, I think, power plays. Like, I think what you have with the Albert Brooks character is, like, what Travis immediately, I think, looks at Albert Brooks' character of Tom and goes, oh, he's obviously sexualizing her. He's got bad thoughts about her. But he has that same thing because it's like, no, but you owning her is not better. Like,
yeah.
And then I think, too, like, the notion of, like, what has he had reinforced but constantly is that, like, women are for his consumption. Like, because he goes to those theaters. Women are there for his consumption. He is disgusted by any woman who does not want his attention but doesn't see himself that way. Would probably not label himself a misogynist. Would never think. He'd be the guy who's like, I can't be a misogynist. I love women. Oh gosh, that's not what that is. Like, you obviously don't have an understanding. It's why it's so laughable that Scorsese calls this a feminist film. It's like, no, it's the thing that I think terrifies me because I think, like, I could see someone watching this, and I hate to gender this male, but I could see a male watching this and be like, well, I mean, he's hurt because he's rejected, and not understand, how Travis isn't rejected. Travis, kind of telecast, like, why she needs to reject him, himself. Like, and I think, because you see all of the dying flowers, like, in his apartment, and then it, like, goes, like, he's on the phone with her, and she's obviously trying to get off the phone, and, like, and it cuts away, and I almost, like, I read something that Scorsese had said that, like, it's supposed to be, like, it's almost too painful to see his shame, and it's like, oh my God, that's not the point. Like, the point is look at, like, you have dying symbols of femininity in his apartment, and we're supposed to, quote unquote, turn away from his shame. No, watch his shame. He has causes. I honestly, the only way you could argue this as a feminist film is if that scene had been shot from Sybil Shepherd's point of view, and then maybe you could start to make arguments.
Scorsese says that's the most important scene in the entire movie.
Oh my God.
He says that we have to turn away because of how pathetic Travis becomes.
Travis is pathetic from the diner sequence. I'm so glad you highlighted the diner sequence.
The diner, and again, the other thing that's interesting that happens in that diner scene is the aspect of, he talks about, how there's this spark between them, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's jumping ahead. He's not doing anything to get to know her.
No.
Right? Like, he is just making them together before having any type of dating or understanding of each other.
He knows her. He's been watching her.
Right. And I think that's really the interesting thing with Betsy in that moment, because Betsy reacts in a more, I would say, affirmative, like, she's willing to keep going, but she doesn't immediately, she thinks about it for a bit.
Yes.
She gives kind of this very, like, well, that's why I'm here, right? Like, moment.
Yeah.
So
cautious.
Yeah, cautious. So I don't think then her turn inside the theater is completely out of nowhere.
No.
I think she knows that every step that she's taking is with caution. She's willing to see how far this, can go, really trying to figure this person out. She's trying to get to know who he is, where he doesn't want that. The weird side thing to this, because you and I talked about this, because I had to actually go back and make sure that I had heard it correctly, and I asked you later, He orders pie at the diner, right?
Oh, God, yeah.
With,
Slice of American cheese.
slice of melted cheese on top of it. I had never heard of this before. Had you?
No.
This is a thing, evidently.
No, it's not.
It's
it can't be
legitimately
a thing.
thing.
It's not allowed.
You can, and I don't know if it's a New York thing. I don't know if it's a Southern thing.
Hey, don't put that on us.
But it is a real thing. But here's your fun fact with it. Ed Gein, when he was arrested...
Oh, my God.
When he got brought in by the police, that was the first thing he asked for. He asked them if he could have a slice of apple pie with cheese on it. I don't know if that was intentional by the filmmakers.
Because only a psychopath would eat that.
So somehow Ed Gein, most influential, psycho in American history on our films, it's really
and
just
very prevalent in season 3 of our podcast.
Right. So we gotta talk about Sybil Shepherd, because there are some things. What is your opinion on her in this role?
I think she's great.
I'm with you. I think she's
great.
Fantastic.
I wanted more. I will say that. And I understood that the perspective here is we're in Travis's story. There's really no other characters in the film. Travis is the character of the film. And I understood that about halfway through, but I really thought to myself, I kind of want more with her, but I know that would have changed some of the intention of the film and changed some of the, I think one of the, kind of sleeplessness aspects of this is the fact that we spend so much time with Travis, and that's what is so unsettling with it.
Yeah.
But I would have wanted more with her.
And I agree. I think Sybil Shepherd is great. The Betsy character, when we get to the end, and how much we talk about that will be interesting, but up until that ending, I think the character is terrific. I think Sybil Shepherd plays it terrific. But she wasn't liked on this set.
Oh, really? Why?
She was despised.
Why?
So at this point, she's a star for The Last Picture Show.
Yes.
That's what she's known for. She later goes on, does moonlighting, and then does a lot of different TV and stuff like that. So I guess she had a little bit of a reputation, supposedly. That, to me, doesn't dismiss some of the things that Schrader says about her.
Okay, who'd we hear Reputation from?
Well, I believe she ended up running off with a director who had been married at one point in one
Whatever,
of her
live
films.
your life, girl.
Hey. There's... The Schrader line, to me, is the most interesting here. He says,
Oh, God.
We always said we were looking for a Sybil Shepherd type. How much worse can she be than a Sybil Shepherd type? But she was always a Sybil Shepherd type.
So he's essentially calling her either a bitch or a whore. He's not calling her.
It feels that way.
He's not saying Sybil Shepherd.
Yes.
He's using, and I apologize for my language to anyone who's listening, but he's not giving me these quotes in advance, so I'm reacting with raw emotion. You know what? I'm not shocked that then he writes that. So I do not like the scene later in the film with her.
You're talking about the ending?
Yes.
It's awful.
I hate it because it feels so noir stereotype of the woman who's aloof and somehow forgiving of this kind of monstrous being. That scene rubbed me the wrong way because I feel and that was where I had to keep writing question marks. Is this about toxic masculinity? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Because when you have a scene like that at the end, does that not just reaffirm that Travis was rejected by a woman and that's why he goes over the edge? Not that Travis himself was the problem all along and she was smart to get away. And I think that ending scene kind of has, or not always, but since we watched it, has rubbed me raw. And that Paul Schrader line, I think, tells me why.
Yeah. So, Paul Schrader is an interesting dude.
I don't know if I'd call him an interesting dude. He sounds kind of awful.
He does. And I think this is a good time to pivot into talking about Iris.
The other of the women,
yeah.
Quote women,
all right.
air quotes.
So, do we want to talk about the positives here or the negatives to Iris?
I don't know where we're. Jodie Foster's performance is incredible.
Okay. So Jodie Foster becomes I know she had done some other things before this. Because was she Freaky Friday? I can't remember.
Yes.
But yeah. So she had a lot of things. She's 12 years old when she plays this 13-year-old hooker. There's no other way to say that, right?
What else are you going to say?
But she's dynamic in the role,
she's
right?
incredible.
Like, I actually thought she had more screen time than I remembered when we watched it, but she doesn't have a ton of screen time, but when she's on, you go, yeah, she deserved that Oscar nomination.
100%.
I'd love to know who beat her out for Best Supporting Actress.
How about it,
So she's terrific.
Actually, Freaky Friday, I think, comes out the same year as Taxi
Same year,
Driver.
okay. She ended up having to, I guess they had to actually have a therapist talk to her before taking the role to make sure she could handle.
Duh!
Yeah. She doesn't, her sister, who's 19 at the time, actually doubles for her in some of the more, we'll call them cringeworthy or violent scenes.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm going to guess and hope maybe that weird dance scene with Harvey Keitel.
I was so uncomfortable.
So uncomfortable.
I'm like, I used to think that the dance sequence in Natural Born Killers was the most uncomfortable dance sequence in a movie. It topped it for me.
So, I don't know when you want to do you want me to give you my casting what if on this?
What was the casting what if on it?
So, actually, it was offered to Melanie Griffith. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So she ends up turning it down because Tippi Hedren, who was her mother, I had no idea.
Yeah. That I knew.
Okay. That was a real big surprise to me. She ends up telling her not to take it. She doesn't want her to take it. She doesn't take it.
Another kid to take this part.
The other two that were up for it, I believe, were Kim Basinger and Linda Blair.
Oh, okay.
But ends up going to Jodie Foster, obviously,
And she's great in it.
But wait, this is where I'm getting about the Schrader stuff.
Oh,
So,
no.
there is a story that just... there is an ick factor. And I'm throwing a lot about Paul Schrader here.
Yeah.
And I think he deserves it. Because I think the griminess of this movie, the uncomfortableness of this movie, all comes from Schrader. I believe, and maybe hope, Scorsese's the one that knows when to pull back. But there is a story that is from Schrader that I think is just really strange. And that's, he says, he went to a bar and he gets picked up by a woman.
Oh, God.
They go back to his hotel. He was shocked by his success, he said, until he realized a couple things.
Oh,
One,
no.
She was a prostitute.
Okay.
2, she was underage.
Was Paul Schrader a pedophile?
And 3, she was a junkie. So he says nothing happens, but he sends Martin Scorsese, who's in the same hotel of him. So I just want you to know, this is from Schrader. This is actually sends Martin Scorsese a note that says, I found Iris. She's in my room. We're having breakfast at 9. Will you please join us? Supposedly Martin Scorsese comes down. They meet. And they rewrite the character. The woman's name had been Garth. I guess at one point then the character was going to be. And, yeah. They said,
so did Scorsese have breakfast with the prostitute?
Yes. So as far as I can tell from everything that I had read, that is all very true. There are some different variations in how that story plays out. But essentially, yeah. I find that really bizarre. I think there are some things that these are important to know about, like kind of the commentary about Sybil Shepherd. You hear this story that's a little bizarre. You hear the backstory of how he ends up writing this. So,
because I think that it's important to you bringing up that story, which I did, my skin is crawling, but like I think it's important because we will talk a lot about Scorsese. Obviously, I know at some point we're going to talk like point of view and cinematography and the Michael Chapman of it all, but like I think one of the things that's interesting here is to think about intention, authorial intent and director's intent, like what Scorsese was trying to achieve with the material versus what maybe Paul Schrader's intentions and experiences were, because I do think that complicates potentially what I think at times is what, like Scorsese says he thinks this is a feminist film or his most feminist film, which I'm like, oh, what, not the line there are 3 kinds of hookers from Wolf of Wall Street? No? Okay. But like I think the fact that you have 2 people who maybe their intentions are slightly askew from each other is a really interesting thing here, because we have something so cringy like that. The character of Iris, and I think, bringing this back to like Travis, and again, like this is an ownership thing. Like, I know 100% we are to applaud Travis for wanting to save a 12-and-a-half-year-old prostitute who has obviously, been wrapped up in like sex trafficking. Like, I understand that is supposed to add to his sympathetic viewpoint, or, and understanding him that way. But the thing is, again, it's that intense ownership that all males in this film seem to have upon the females in this film. Even Tom has that, like even Albert Brooks's character, because he's very immediately protective.
Yes.
So it's really hard for me not to see or see Scorsese's perspective in this, is that all these males feel like they have to do this thing. And look, 100%, like, there's no denying, like, Iris needed to not be in that situation. But it's the way in which, like, Travis is so angered by her not wanting to get out, not thinking about, this is a 12-and-a-half-year-old girl who has been given drugs, who has no idea what's going on, and obviously left home hoping for something very different, and never understanding her psychology in this, but completely being pissed at anyone who doesn't understand his psychology and things. It's what makes, like, that situation, it's like, yeah, I get it, and yes, is it incredibly satisfying when he shoots a bunch of pedophiles? Yeah, but also, like, Travis is not as removed from the people he villainizes in the film as he thinks he is. Like, he is just as much of a participant in that, of, like, this ownership of her. Like, so that's why when you get that letter at the end, and I know we'll get to that portion of it, it just makes the Iris character, and I think those interactions, really interesting. I think it's, like, interesting she tries to, like, say, like, no, I wasn't in your cab. I was probably really messed up that night. Like, as though she, has chosen this, and not understanding, like, you need to go on this with a soft hand, because this young girl wants to believe she has agency in her life. We all know that she doesn't, but she needs to feel like she does. And he never wants to actually find a way out for her. He just wants to find how he can be the hero.
Yeah, but he's not trying to be a hero.
No, I know.
Right? I think that's something... We talked a lot about how we're going to have to discuss the pop culture icon that Travis has become compared to the actual character that Travis is. And I think this happens a lot. It reminds me a lot of Alex DeLarge from A Clockwork Orange.
Yes.
And listen, I will fully say it's one of my all-time favorite films, A Clockwork Orange. But as I the more you watch it, the more you have to understand, like... Yeah, it makes a cool Halloween costume, but we got to remember what these characters are. They are not good people.
No, Alex DeLarge is a rapist. Like,
yes,
yeah.
And Travis is, a murderer. I mean, there's no way to say it any differently. He wants to kill the senator, or I'm sorry, he's senator. Yes,
senator,
that's right, Senator Palpatine.
Yeah, I couldn't.
We both kept just wanting to do Senator Palpatine.
I did write, like, earlier in the movie. I was like, so am I to assume that he's going to try and kill Palpatine? Like, I did. Right. I wrote it, like, earlier.
By the way, I before Harvey Keitel was actually offered that role. It was
Palpatine.
Yeah, Palpatine.
Oh, okay.
So he's, and this is something I even wrote in my notes. Why does he choose to kill or go after or want to have this attempt on Palpatine's life? He talks about it as he wants to make this mark, but he knows nothing about the senator. We aren't giving anything to go. He never even, in those journals that we're hearing, gives an actual reason of like, oh, well, the senator's, what he believes about this or that, I mean, we know that ultimately this is just a jilted man who's at the end of his rope and decides, I'm going to go out and I'm going to leave this mark in this world, whether it's good or bad. I mean, he somehow puts it in his head that it's a good thing.
Yeah.
But there's nothing. He doesn't even give us anything to make us understand why he's doing it.
Well, and I think that's the thing that makes Scorsese's unpacking of this so interesting. It's the fact that he doesn't actually have... Like, I think that's... What, to me, this film makes a commentary on most astutely and unfortunately and hauntingly still resonates today, is how often these extremist, loner, and I'm sorry to say, males oftentimes their own morality is not rooted in anything that is an actual ideology, but is just rooted in their self-righteousness and their need to feel self-important. And I think that's why he goes after Palatine. I think you are to code this as, well, that was his ex-girlfriend's boss, so he's going to go after. Like, I think you're to take it as, you said, jilted. I think you're to take it that way.
I agree with you. I don't think there's anything that,
No, and I don't think, because his ideology is, I think that's what makes it elusive in the film. Because, like, you have, so if we go back, you have that scene where Martin Scorsese plays, like, the cab, like, he gets a cab, right? Which oh my gosh, in the span of disturbing scenes in this film, to me is one of the most disturbing scenes, if not the most disturbing scene. But you have this scene where Travis is like frozen. This person is talking about abject violence, abject racism, abject terror on a woman because she's done him wrong. And Travis is frozen. Like, he is in such a state of inaction. And you get to see that in action again, where he like talks to himself in the apartment and like and tries to like get out a gun and is so ineffective. And I think that's what this film is showing us, is like, he doesn't, the person who's in the back of that cab is terrifying and resolved in what he's going to do. I think you are to really think that guy is going to go kill his wife. Like, you are to understand that, and that to him, that is justice for what she's done to him. And I think like Travis is frozen in it, because I think when really confronted with it, like, he doesn't really know where his ideology is. Could he do that? Because really what he should have done then is, if he's jilted, then he should have gone after Sybil Shepherd in his own sense of like, right and wrong, and who's wronged him and who this needs to be taken out on. And you have a terrifying scene with Scorsese, and it's like horrifying and regressive and racist and misogynistic. And Travis just like soaks it in, but almost the way De Niro plays it, he looks kind of scared. He does. He looks scared.
He does.
Of what he's hearing. But it's like, but dude, you're doing the same stuff. Do you not? I think.
But he's not at that point.
No, I know.
But I start to think that
there.
is, yes, I think that starts to get there, and that's really shows when he goes and he buys the guns, and then the first gun he asks for is the gun that character is talking about.
That's a great point. So do you think then that like cab fare, he believes that that's him then performing masculinity? Like, is it performative what we see Travis do throughout the rest of the film?
But he then manifests it into that's, machoism, that's bravado, that's what you do.
Well, and I think you see Travis too as someone like who's so ready to take out that role of like what that guy is saying in the back of the cab, but is like clearly not ready to deal with any of the implications of what that actually means. Like, you see that in the failed assassination attempt. Like, we think he's scouting it out like he's got a plan. He doesn't really have a plan, because he's got opportunity, but does not know how to seize the opportunity, I guess.
No. I wanted to say one quick thing was interesting about, what did you think of Scorsese's performance?
So uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable. I thought he was actually very good.
He's actually very good.
He's extremely uncomfortable.
Sorry. You mean like objectively from an acting
standpoint?
Yeah,
because
he's good at it.
That actually role, he wasn't supposed to play that part.
Oh, really?
The actor George Mamoli, who was supposed to play it, got hurt and couldn't show up the day of.
Wow.
Nobody knew Scorsese was going to do it. Scorsese just had to make a decision. He knew the part. He gets into the cab, and he does give De Niro a lot of credit, because he said De Niro kind of helped coach him through it.
Oh, wow.
But nobody on set knew that he was going to be playing the part, because the guy got hurt last minute and he had to step in. Well, which also explains why you have the weird cameo of Scorsese earlier in the film looking like a completely different person when he's looking at Sybil Shepherd walk by and kind of leering at her. I don't think they're supposed to be the same character, but...
But, and that's because, Marty's performance is great. It's terrifying. It's chilling. I 100% believe him as someone resolved to do this.
Very chilling.
Like, it is a terrifying moment. And I do think it's a really an important shift in the film. And then perhaps, unfortunately, as I think you're helping me to understand, like, kind of an inspiration point then for what Travis ends up doing.
Because so this starts to lead into my favorite character of the entire movie, Easy Andy.
Oh!
Who's the gun dealer.
Yes.
Because I find him very interesting on screen. He comes in a suit. He's showing all these guns to Travis in a very like professional manner. But then what's interesting is then when he starts talking about the other drugs, he starts to pick up his pace. He starts to talk a little more frantic. But I apologize. We've been so heavy in this topic. I have to give this interesting story about this Easy Andy gentleman. So he ends up being played by a gentleman by the name of Stephen Prince. Stephen Prince was actually a friend of Martin Scorsese. Stephen Prince was actually a junkie and a hustler.
Oh, gosh.
and a part-time roadie. Just an interesting individual. Scorsese finds him so interesting, so he puts him in this role. But then actually makes a short documentary about him.
Oh.
Okay? And I'm going somewhere with this. So it's called American Boy. I believe it's like an hour long. Doesn't really ever get released. So it's just essentially following him. Think kind of Crumb and those types of things.
Yeah.
But what's interesting... So he's a very interesting individual. But why this is so important to talk about is, so in this documentary, there is a point where he's talking about these moments in his life. He starts telling this story, and follow me here, about how he was with some friends, and they had somebody OD. As the individual OD'd, they had to figure out how to help the person. So they decided that they needed to give them an adrenaline shot and literally had to read the book while the person was dying from an overdose. And this is literally Prince talking, says they took a magic marker, put it on the chest bone, had to drive it in between the chest bones.
Wait, did Tarantino take this from the documentary?
So, my understanding is Tarantino, when he was working in the, we always hear about him working in the film store, got a copy of this documentary and took that story.
This is my favorite thing.
And puts it into Pulp Fiction.
This is my favorite story you've ever told me. Oh my gosh. And I'm okay being hyperbolic about that because that is so fantastic.
So just this weird, kind of through line of, so that's my Easy Andy story.
And I love the inspiration of, fast talking director to fast talking director.
Right.
Gosh.
Oh, absolutely.
Can we talk for a second about point of view in this film?
You have to.
I know we have been talking about Travis, but one of the things I think I find so fascinating is what Scorsese labels. I kept calling them overhead shots, but I read something that said he calls them the priest's eye.
Yeah, I just read
spoken
that.
like a good Catholic. But I thought one of the things I like about this is because it gives us this sense of someone's kind of always watching. Even though we are so ingrained in Travis's mind and point of view, there's this sense that there's this larger thing watching, or that we're the larger thing being forced to watch the violence and kind of the baked in extremism that happens underneath our noses, and without really any, or the ways in which we don't take any recourse for that, or also in the ways in which we have no way of stopping it without great systemic change. And you see this in the failed assassination attempt, it goes above into the pre-side view. You see it in the political office, above the, quote unquote work of politics of you get that overhead shot. And then most distinctly, at the end, you have this great, this really well-crafted shootout scene where, you have Travis, taking his revenge, although not super stylized. I mean, he's not good at what he's doing. Yeah. He's effective, but he's not good at what he's doing. And then you get that drifting shot, and I'm just Scorsese, you damn genius. This is such a smart way, because it's so unsettling of why am I floating over this carnage? I mean, I'm I don't care that any of you died. You're all bad people, but you're also making me float over, and it's really uncomfortable.
Absolutely. It's my favorite shot of the entire movie.
Is it really?
It really is.
Okay.
Really, yeah, I agree. And that's why I think, again, we're going to talk about the epilogue here in a second, but the epilogue to me is so, because you end the movie there, you end on this amazing shot. You're telling so much in that moment.
Yes.
Just phenomenal.
Well, because, again, you have this, sense of, this, vigilante justice of, I think the thing where it's, hard to reconcile the end of this, because you have Travis, tries to assassinate a politician. He kills someone who is robbing a bodega. And then you have what happens at the end. And I think, where he kills like all of the people who are, essentially like the pimp and the, essentially all these people who are like working in this flop house, like where there's a child prostitute, like, and I think you have this like sense of like, just kind of how far his violence can go. You have so much of like, because there's that scene of him earlier when he's like in the theater, and this is like towards like him really kind of like coming to this like violent fruition of like, he's like almost starting to shield his eyes from the sexuality on screen, but then he turns his hand into a gun.
Yeah.
And you see this like obsession of like, he thinks this is like ultimate control. If he has this weapon, if he has this ability, that all of a sudden he's somehow empowered by this. Like, he now has control over this like unkempt and wild city as he likes to like view it. But like, I think one of the like really interesting things you get with that like kind of end sequence is kind of like you see all of this carnage, and like, I mean, he's not, again, like, even though we've seen him at the shooting range, we've seen him practicing, we get all of these kind of really manic moments of him like practicing taking his gun out and strapping it to himself. Like, he really honestly is not, he's not skilled, but and I think that's what makes it more terrifying. He's not skilled, but he could still do it if he wanted to, because he obviously does. And this is, again, like, and that last sequence is, again, a credit to, so the cinematographer for this film is Michael Chapman, who did the cinematography for Raging Bull, which is obviously incredible. Also did cinematography for The Lost Boys.
Oh, interesting.
Scrooged.
Okay.
And Ghostbusters 2.
I love all those movies.
No, Michael Chapman's like a legend.
Yeah.
Like, but I think it's just what he does, because 70s grime, like you pointed out, like the sanitation strike, and there's a sense of, certainly from a historical standpoint, what New York City was going through, and like, kind of the intense systemic racial things that were happening in the city. But you have to get someone who can shoot this in a way, again, those visual disruptions, knowing to pair the score, knowing how to light this. Like, it's really like disturbing. Like, the scene with like Harvey Keitel and Iris is kind of beautifully lit, and that makes it all the more, again, like all those disruptions, like, and I think, no more so far than where you're at this really beautiful shot of like all this like carnage again in this like house.
Yeah, and I mean, you have the colors of the cop cars when you're outside, and how those. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a beautifully done scene, and really just a perfect encapsulation of where we start it to where we end it. So, kind of looking big picture of all this production, you have these beautiful shots. You talk about the score. The score plays such a major portion of that. Like, the two just blend so well. So that you talked about Bernard Herrmann, who had done the score. He had done Psycho, Cape Fear, and Citizen Kane, a legend. Weird thing about him is he did this score, finalized it, sent it, and passed away just a couple hours later.
No. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah, so really weird thing. And he ends up getting a Oscar nomination for it. And I think this score really, you talked about the neo-noir at the beginning, is so significant. It's this beautiful, but at times, it plays with the visual just absolutely perfectly for that era and that time, and again, kind of just speaking to, is it happy, is it sad? It's a really haunting type score that I think is really done well.
No, I completely agree with you. There's like that.
I'm not saying anything. Yeah.
No, it's that neo-noir. Like, I almost just picture, a lilting cigarette and a flashing neon light. Like, there's something about this that, like, and I think that's, again, like, it's all of those disruptions. How do you have this like really beautiful music with this man who's going to incite like such violence, and obviously I think would have gone as far, you get the sense of what he was planning at the failed assassination attempt, the kind of the traumatic thing that could have been. So you have this really incredible score, and again, it's like in such like conflict with like the tradition of noir. I mean, the music sounds like it's from a noir film.
Yeah.
And it fits so perfectly with this, because almost like how we romanticize those like noir vibes, but what is noir films but like violence?
Right.
Yeah.
And speaking of violence, so the whole movie's so well crafted, right?
Yes.
And this is where we get into a lot of those what ifs. There's so many what ifs with this movie. Scorsese wasn't the original director of this movie.
What?
Brian De Palma was.
I
That's a whole different.
That's a
it's
different
a different
movie.
tone of a movie,
Yes.
right? Like I think that's the thing. I think we're getting the same movie, but a different tone. The violence, I think, is much more in your face as opposed to artfully done.
I think it's more, Travis is a more quote unquote effective killer.
Yeah.
In Brian De Palma's hands.
I also think though that there's less ambiguity.
Yes.
In De Palma's hands.
Because I don't think that De Palma, and I'm not even saying necessarily which way this would have gone, I don't think he would have left a lot of it up to audience interpretation.
Agreed.
I don't, and I say this not as a cut at De Palma, I don't know if he would have trusted his audience enough to like make those leaps about Travis. But I mean, also the pop culture aspect of Travis Bickle, like, should Scorsese have trusted his audience that much? Because he comes a dorm room poster. Like,
well, all right, yeah, it's a good time to talk about that. What makes this movie, so iconic today, right? So pop culture iconic. We talked about that at the beginning. What's, the pop culture icon that is Travis compared to the actual character of Travis.
well, because I think you have something here. Like, I get it. Like, look at like his whole look, like the whole design of Travis, like the mohawk, the aviator shades, the army jacket. He's so immediately recognizable, and it's kind of like you brought up earlier about the Alex DeLarge, the black eyelashes, the bowler hat, the white shirt. It's like, it's so immediately iconic, and I think, Travis, I think, manifests as a character, like, a lot of, like, internal, like, that internal suppression we have of, like, how we deal with the things that are traumatizing and hard in society, and feeling helpless and feeling downtrodden. And I think you get to see someone who expresses that. And unfortunately, I think like the lesson you're supposed to take from that is like, we have to be careful of the Travis Bickles that we ignore and then potentially give rise to. Unfortunately, though, I think what Travis Bickle can represent for people is, here is a lonely person. Here is someone who is sympathetic, who's just trying to figure things out, and then kills a bunch of pedophiles, so that's cool. But then what that pop culture version of him doesn't deal with is all of that other baked-in misogyny and racism and violence that is inherent to this character.
Yeah, because it's a complete pivot when Travis goes after Sport, excuse me. When he goes after him, it's because his assassination attempt is thwarted, right? Like, he ends up being spotted because he had done it terribly, because he had talked to the, which I never quite understood what was the purpose of him talking, other than, was it supposed to be showing like, I don't know if he was trying to figure something out. I didn't really understand his talking to the Secret Service agent.
No, it doesn't make sense. And then the thing is like, could you have showed up to that rally looking any more suspicious? Like, you were so sus, dude. Like,
well, and the mohawk is taken from military. Which is, I guess, something when a lot of military go on quote-unquote kind of kamikaze missions or very dangerous missions, that many times, this was actually Scorsese had said somebody that they do these types of things to their hair.
I didn't know that. That's kind of interesting in itself.
Yeah, and you were talking a lot about this, like, so we have to talk about something that gets, it's starting to people forget about. This movie does inspire a very major event of its own Travis Bickle in its own right? Which is John Hinckley, who does the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
And it's essentially the same thing. He becomes obsessed with the movie. And you and I are not proponents that, think that the movies create people, but there are some things that have to be discussed. And Hinckley becomes obsessed with it. He becomes obsessed with Jodie Foster. He becomes a stalker to her. And then finally, to get her attention, he tries to assassinate Ronald Reagan. So this is where we talked about at the beginning, right? It's inspired by an assassination attempt, and then eventually inspires an assassination attempt. So it shows right there the type of character that Travis is, and the type of character that can become.
Well, and I think
unchecked.
And I think you and I, and you've already stated this, but just like to be clear, like I don't think you and I are ever going to say like the movies made people do it. Like, no, that's not the case. Like, violence is violence, and like, it's I don't think those things can be influential. It's weird to think about though that you have someone who becomes fascinated by an actress in this film and thinks this, because isn't it like he thought it would impress her?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you think about how people can pervert the messages of films to fit their own interpretations or their own needs of what they want to see Travis Bickle to be. And I think that's where you get like a lot of that kind of like, and I know I'm saying dorm room fodder. I mean, any kind of pop culture recognition of this. What I knew is you talking to me. I didn't know he became violent. Mm. I knew essentially there was the mohawk and the aviator shit, so I knew something happened in Change of Appearance.
You were like, that nice boy Travis at the end of the movie.
Like, I had...
Played by that nice gentleman, Robert DeNiro.
Yeah, I had no idea where this is going,
Yeah.
so to see this, like, through to its, like, bitter end and understand, like, kind of the tragedy and the trauma and the, like, kind of insolence and the, self-righteous nature of like Travis Bickle like is really having to watch that progression, not knowing where it was going, and also knowing how popularized that image has become is kind of disturbing, like watching it now.
Yeah, and I like to think that everybody's not glorifying what I think they're just it's almost forgetting what, Travis has done throughout the movie, yes. Right? Like we get the heavy lines, we get the imagery, like you talked about, iconic costuming. It's really interesting because obviously the most quoted line, the most popular line is the "you talking to me," right? Which is considered one of the top, again, using AFI here, voted one of the top 100 film quotes of all time. But what's really interesting is that was ad-libbed by Robert De Niro.
Good job, Robert De Niro.
And do you know where it came from? Bruce Springsteen.
Wow. So
what happened was he had been at a Bruce Springsteen concert for Born to Run like the week before or so.
Nice.
The timelines on those stories may change, but and what happened was Scorsese just put him in front of the mirror and said, just kind of ad-lib, thing. So we just want to see you kind of pulling the guns, kind of doing that, ad-lib. He ends up... So I guess Bruce Springsteen during the concert had come out. Born to Run's huge. Everybody's chanting, Bruce, Bruce, Bruce. Bruce Springsteen goes, "You talking to me?" to the audience.
No!
So De Niro ends up, saying this line in the movie.
Probably the sweet and very charming way Bruce Springsteen said that to an audience, chanting his name and then thinking about what that ends up becoming. And what a turn.
Paul Schrader had said it's the best thing in the movie, and I didn't write it.
I'm good with Paul Schrader, if I'm being honest. So let's talk ending of this film.
Oh, yeah.
So you didn't remember that Travis Bickle died.
I had forgotten that, yes.
What's your interpretation of the end of this film? Which I have to say, to be very fair, podcast audience, I did not know that there was an interpretive aspect to the end of the film. I took it as what was represented to me.
So let's start about this. So there's a lot of interpretations that epilogue after the shooting that... is considered a fantasy. It's Travis dying, and this is the fantasy he has in his head of what he believes he just did and the life that comes after it. And that is one interpretation of this movie. And my kind of question to you is, do you buy that? Do you feel it? Did you watch it and think that was an interpretation of it?
No, I thought the terrifying reality I'm left with is that a psychopathic incel ends up becoming a hero to a family who just wanted their daughter back, and he gets redeemed in ways he should have never been redeemed.
I'm with you.
That's the message it left me with.
I did forget about it. I think the movie's stronger without this back end of it, but I'm with you rewatching it, last week. No, I don't see it as a fantasy. I believe Roger Ebert had thought that this was a possibility of it, and I think it might be a way for people to explain the ending and kind of what you're talking about, right? Which is he becomes a hero. Betsy, he has this moment with Betsy where he almost gets this upper hand on Betsy.
I hate.
I don't understand why they choose to have Betsy almost look at Travis in a different way. None of it really, it doesn't feel to me like it holds with the entire rest of the film.
No.
And I will say, it's not the intention of the filmmakers.
So they wanted it to be...
Yeah. DeNiro has come out many times and said Travis isn't dead. He has actually talked about how he wanted to do a Taxi Driver years later. And actually even has said recently, like, because he believes that Travis goes on and still kills. Like, he believes that Travis is not a good person. He's not redeemed. I will give, and that he is just, this was the moment that started him, right? And, and then you bring in the internet and all of that aspect.
I want to see that movie.
It's an interesting thought.
I want to see that movie and not Joker that masqueraded as this movie.
Well, glad you said that. We can't leave this without talking about...
Because that's the only thing you let me say to you is I looked at you at the end and I'm like, so Joker just totally ripped off.
Yes.
Which I never knew because I had never seen this movie and then got so angry with.
Well, I mean, the argument there is that Todd Phillips is doing a homage, right?
No. An homage... No, that's not an homage. That's I ripped your idea and hope nobody would notice.
And it's why Joker has never sat 100% with me, because I think Joaquin Phoenix is phenomenal in that role. I think I think it's a really well done movie. The problem is it's a movie, like you said, it's been done. It was Taxi Driver. There's no way to look at it any different.
That movie needed to end 10 minutes earlier,
with King of Comedy as well.
Yeah.
It's I mean, he does both of them, right?
But the movie needed to end 10 minutes earlier. As well.
Right.
Which is always...
But isn't that the...
But the way it is. It's all... Well, yeah, because you see, the Joker has to be coming here. Yeah, because they just completely, rip this movie.
But it also feels like, does Todd Phillips believe that it's a fantasy, right? Like, Taxi Driver is a fantasy at the end. Because it builds into what they do at the end of Joker, of whether or not all of this happened in, the Joker's head.
Fair. Let's please end this talking about Scorsese and not about Todd Phillips. I just can't. All right, I'm gonna ask a big question.
Yep.
Do you have a favorite Scorsese film?
Yes. I will be honest, I have a lot of how could yous of earlier Scorsese and probably maybe even his more popular things. I become more of a fan in the 2000s, and I love the majority of his films. I have two that would lead at the top, but I have to say Aviator is probably my favorite.
You will get ripped apart for that being your favorite, but
I
appreciate you.
Hugo's my second favorite, so...
You'll get further ripped apart for that as being your top two.
Listen, I can go and talk about all these great movies that he does. Obviously, I want to know yours.
He's a genius. The Aviator's my favorite Scorsese film.
Thank you.
But that's here's the thing. The parts of Scorsese that I love the best is his... And listen, I understand the recent Marvel, conversations aside. He is someone who loves film. And Aviator is an expression of a filmmaker who loves film. And I also love how that story's told. I love how it's shot. It's beautiful. I'm a massive fan of Goodfellas. I have a very soft place in my heart for the movie Gangs of New York. I don't care if anyone doesn't like Cameron Diaz in that movie. I love that movie. I love, The Departed can be really interesting. I've got my bugaboos with The Wolf of Wall Street, but there's stuff in it that's effective. And now I'm just talking about his, entire film. I love Raging Bull. But The Aviator just...
How could you for me? And I'm a huge boxing
Shut
fan.
up. So, listen, I know about the Goodfellas thing. You're telling me you've not seen Raging Bull?
Dude. Yeah, I know. I didn't realize he directed Color of Money, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, I was a little surprised.
Oh, my God. You've not seen Raging... Oh, we got to talk after the pod.
No, I'm with you a lot of these. The Departed was a movie I didn't love it the first time I saw it, but the more I've watched it over the years, I actually really enjoy it a lot. I think Shutter Island is underrated. I think it's really, really good. Obviously, everybody, if anybody comes at us about Aviator or even talking about Hugo, haven't been listening, because you and I love, the history of Hollywood. We love, the history of filmmaking. Both of those movies are, in weird ways, love letters to Hollywood and filmmaking, and that's why we're going to gravitate towards them. So it's about what we are passionate about, even more than the, because obviously, I haven't seen some of these, Taxi Driver is probably maybe a better constructed film. I don't know. There are other things we could talk about. Everything I know from Goodfellas is probably, maybe his best.
Goodfellas is incredible. I'll say this, though. We didn't make a ranking for this because we knew we were going to be talking so much about the film. I'm going to be very honest with you. I was making a ranking of top 5. Taxi Driver would be eking out there for me. I'm
okay, good. Because I wanted to end this with finding that out from you, because I didn't know. Do you like Taxi Driver?
Oh, this movie's genius. So listen.
I hope everybody has sat through this entire show to get to the end to find out that you actually love this movie.
Maybe I'll put a thing like fast forward to the end, just so those of you who are big fans of Taxi Driver. Look, I'm not going to sit there and not be critical. I'm not going to sit there and not discuss what is happening here with representations of women, what is happening here with representations of racism in New York City in the 70s and beyond. I'm not going to pretend like I can't watch this and think about those parts. This movie is effective. It's chilling. It's very unfortunately still works today. It's brilliant. It's haunting. The performances are incredible. Scorsese, like what he does with a camera is just like no one can touch him with this movie. This movie is genius. I don't know if I want to sit down and watch it again, but we stopped watching it and I've thought about it several times a day since we've watched it. It's a great film.
It's a sign of a good movie. If it just sits in there, yeah.
And honestly, we're at an hour 24? At this point, I could go for another hour.
Yeah.
Really just breaking down all other aspects of the film too, because it is an incredible thing. Yeah, there are things that like make me itchy about it, but I think that's the point. Like, I do think Scorsese is trying to have conversations. I think he is trying to make us cautious about certain things. I'm not saying that he does this really well in every film that he does, and I am not saying he's without his problems, but he does something with this film that I think really resonates, and I think for some people for some really demented reasons, and I think for some people some very cautious reasons.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head. It's the type of movie you should come out and feel uncomfortable about, not the type of movie you should come out and think is cool.
Yes.
And I think that's what it really just breaks down to, right? Like, it's, are you looking at the film from the construction and what it's trying to say and its point of view and all of the things that we've been discussing today? Or are you looking at it because Robert De Niro looks awesome in a mohawk, and looks badass saying a cool line in the mirror, like.
Well, yeah, and it's and I completely agree with you, and there is there's something to it. Like, art is supposed to be uncomfortable. We are supposed to confront things. And listen, I love the soft and the lovely and the heart-filled stories of films that we've talked about previously. I also love films that make me uncomfortable and make me have to think and make me have to really reconcile what I'm participating in when I watch a movie. I like films that do that. And I know it probably seem like a fluffy-headed optimist who does not want to be uncomfortable, but I like being uncomfortable when I watch a movie. And this movie made me fucking uncomfortable.
Right. So here's my quick question as we finish this up.
Yes.
My last what if.
Yes.
De Niro, amazing. He comes off Godfather 2.
Don't tell me there was someone else who's supposed to play this.
To play this part, he takes he actually takes a pay cut to take this part. He was not the original person offered this role.
Oh God, who?
Dustin Hoffman. Come on, we gotta do. I don't know. I think Dustin Hoffman would have been interested in this role. You don't see, No.
Here's the thing. Dustin Hoffman's great. I don't think he can't pull Travis Bickle. I actually think he's
he doesn't.
Is he a more disturbing Travis Bickle because it comes out of left field?
Well, I think he's more what this character sometimes is, right? Because you got to think Graduate Dustin Hoffman, right?
Yeah, because De Niro's not an everyman.
Yeah.
Everyman loves De Niro, but De Niro's not an everyman.
No, not at all. Especially at that time. I mean, he is just, he's just an awesome, cool, handsome guy, right? Where I'm just feeling like Ben Braddock, gets after that bus ride, at the end of the
realizes
Graduate,
he doesn't want to be with her.
She
goes to the big city.
Then he goes to New York City.
Peace out of California.
I think, I just think it's a fun what if, but it's De Niro's role. I mean, obviously.
Well, hey, I am glad to have filmed this gap in my film knowledge. I am happy to have seen Taxi Driver. I think I'll be thinking about it for a very long time, and it just gives me another Scorsese film that I get to love. If you've never seen Taxi Driver, how could you not have seen Taxi Driver? Follow us on social media at How Could You Podcast on Instagram, at How Could You Pod on Twitter. You can always send us suggestions and your own rantings and journal entries to howcouldyoupodcast@gmail.com. Please stay tuned for the cocktail of the episode, which feels weird with this movie, but we're going to do it anyways.
And until next time, enjoy the Odyssey.